Michelle.
Daniel,
OG
OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about how do you tell the difference between something you want that's good, something you're tempted that you shouldn't want, what is temptation? Is temptation good? Well, obviously it's not good, but, maybe you can be tempted by something good.
There are the temptations, though.
Yeah, like chocolate. Yeah, right.
I'm saying like the music group.
Oh, you're right. They are
Come
good.
on, Dan.
But can you be tempted? Can you want something good, but it's a temptation because the way you want it is bad, and different things like that?
Yeah. Like I think that I've been thinking about that. Like this idea of, is it necessary? Like there are certain things that maybe one wanting and knowing they shouldn't want is bad, but maybe there could be a way in which they redirect that want or something, or like find a way to satisfy that in a way that isn't actually wrong, or something that they wouldn't really don't fall in line with their values or their virtues. But I just think it's interesting because this idea of, if you're tempted to want to do something, I wonder if this does relate to a sense of self. Like, because you might want to do it because you feel like that's really who you are. And if you don't do it, or if you don't acknowledge it or something, then you don't feel like you're really being who you are. Now, I think that every person is probably a combination of wanting good things and sometimes wanting not good things. And sometimes I guess what I mean to say is the things that are not good, quote unquote, that are wanted, maybe the things that they want are more of a representation of something bigger of what they want that is actually not bad, that they want it.
Right.
But it's maybe the particularities of how they might satisfy it that would be wrong or bad. If it doesn't like fall in line with their values. Now, maybe that bigger thing that it represents could be still met in full, actually, in another avenue. Or
right.
And I guess I just think that's interesting. Like, is temptation then like a feeling? Is it simply a feeling? Not that that's like simple. That can be very complex. Sure. But those are some of the questions that come to mind.
Well, I mean, if we follow St. Augustine, where evil is a misordered good, then you can only be tempted for good things in misordered ways.
Yeah.
Like, so what's the difference between being tempted by something and wanting something? Like, for example, if there's ice cream on the counter, one person it might be a temptation because they're having a diet. For another person, it's just a want. They're healthy and they don't eat a lot, so they just want it, and it's okay, right? So temptation suggests almost by definition that it's bad. Like, you're tempted. Like, it's a bad thing that you want. But then the question becomes, what makes the ice cream on the table bad, versus good? And that would ultimately get tied to the schema of the individual, like the person. Like, someone who's on a diet, they would be a temptation. Someone who's not on a diet, it would not be a temptation. It would just be something they wanted. But maybe it is even a temptation for that person because it's not healthy, right, to eat ice cream, right? So
It's not?
Yeah, okay. Wow, I'm so sorry, listeners. There was no warning. I was about to tell you something that might change your life. I'm so sorry.
There can be some healthy versions of ice cream.
Yes, that's all you need to know, listeners. And what is in your fridge is the healthy version. Don't worry. Do not worry. But no, so for one person it's clearly a temptation.
Yeah.
For another person it is not clearly a temptation.
Yeah, no. And it makes me think of the word. I wonder, I think the word must have some connection, temptation to temperament, temperature.
Yes.
And temperature is in degrees.
Yes.
Right? Temperature measures degrees of heat, right?
Yes.
And so, and heat and it's interesting because calories come from like calor, which is heat. Anyways, and that would be like passion. A lot of times I think temptation is tied into what makes one feel passionate.
Yeah, so your temperature goes up,
yeah.
right? It feels hotter in the room.
It feels hotter. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that's the thing, though. It's not bad. I think passion is a good thing. It's just about how it's directed, right? How is it, again, like fire?
I think, temptation also, like temp job is like temporary. There's an idea of temporary, temptation is supposed to be temporary. It will pass quickly. It will go. So one of the reasons it can be bad to give into a temptation is the idea that you're giving into something that ultimately the pleasure of it will be fleeting.
Yeah.
And then the negativity of it will be long term.
Yeah.
Like, is it a temptation to want to be married? Well, it depends. Maybe because God, if you're in a Christian context, maybe God called you to be a monk or something, so then marriage would be a temptation, right? But in, other than that very specific situation, it would not be bad to be married.
Right.
But maybe you would be tempted to trick a woman into marriage or trick a guy or use certain, like, dating apps and algorithms to kind of bring somebody into a marriage who didn't know what they were getting into or something, right? One could come up with the example. So what's strange about a temptation is it necessarily entails a want, right?
Yes.
Like it wouldn't be a temptation if you didn't feel any want. And you can have this kind of dance between like, well, it's not, it's good to want to be married. It can be good to want to be married given but then the way you go about marriage could be a temptation. But for another person who has been, like I mentioned, the monk, then marriage would be a temptation, right? So so it seems to have a lot to do with the individual circumstance.
Oh yes, it does seem extremely contextual. I think it reminds me of what Rivera has talked about with Adam Phillips, this concept of like the unforbidden pleasures.
Mm-hmm.
I think that could help if somebody is struggling with temptation for something that they. I think first of all you have to think too is like what is this more largely representing? Because again, maybe what it's largely representing is not wrong, but the specifics of how you want to accomplish it is wrong. And I think I think that's a great point with the temporary. It's the problem with it is that it does come and go. It's like a flash and then it's gone. And so unfortunately you might make some very rash decision on something that comes and goes, but the consequence doesn't come and go, right? It's there with you potentially forever. There's always redemption, grace, etc. But I think that this idea of the unforbidden pleasures is helpful that Phillips brings up, because I think sometimes temptation narrows our view very much.
Yes.
And there's actually a lot of unforbidden things that are just as pleasurable.
Yes.
That would be a great way to actually, you've got so much that can already satisfy. And so you can let go a little bit more easily of the thing that's such a temptation.
Yes.
And then also not have this like identity crisis or something, because you're like, well, what that represents is actually still over here.
Yes.
It's just I haven't seen it as it's not the forbidden fruit, and so I haven't been so focused on it. Like, because I think the temptation is often a kind of, like we said, this temporary flash type of thing. But because it's so focused on it, becomes very big, right? It becomes very consuming.
Yes.
But really, it's actually very small. And the unforbidden pleasures are actually very, kind of all around in a sense.
Yes.
And so they're actually what takes up more place and has more abundance to it, if you will. And so I think that can be helpful, because then it's sort of just as a perspective shift, where you're not just laser focused on this temptation. Right, and you start to see a more amplio, more like a wider view of all the things that are pleasurable, right, that have not been deemed, forbidden.
Well, I think one of the things that's important is kind of the examination of the phenomenological experience of a temptation versus a want.
Yeah, no, that's...
Like what do you feel when you want
Guilt,
something?
shame?
Like, when you're tempted by something, like, when you feel that is the word you should use to describe what you are currently going through.
Yes.
How is that different from situations where you feel like it's appropriate to use the word want? Like,
isn't it guilt and shame, though?
Well, I think the guilt and shame is retrospect. Like, we're talking about before giving into the temptation, like thinking about giving into the...
But I do think that that does impact the phenomenological experience, because if you did do it...
Well, of course. I mean, there's a future element. Yeah, there's an idea that if you do it, there will be guilt and shame.
Well, and the fact that you're like, I shouldn't do it, isn't that a type of, like, you're sort of saying it's off limits? And the fact
I guess the word guilt, I want to say that's the kind of the cost of the temptation. There's the knowledge, but you don't necessarily feel the guilt before the temptation. Like in the phenomenological analysis, it would be, what are you feeling in the experience of the temptation? You know that you'll feel the guilt. There's this sense of this double pull, right? There's this kind of pull away, and there's this pull toward.
It's like, I want, but I shouldn't.
Yeah, there's
this shouldn't aspect.
That's very
that's
interesting.
Unique to it.
The reason it's interesting is because, like you were mentioning, there's this idea that if you don't do what you want to do, then you're not your true self, right? And there's an assumption that your true self equals your wants, right?
Yeah.
Well, first off, I think it's very dangerous for your mental health to associate your want with you. Like, to just boil yourself down to a single dimension and make want what characterizes who you are. You have emotions, you have imagination, you have a lot more things that make up you than want, even if want has a guiding principle, if it seems to matter in some different ways. Second, there is an assumption that if you feel a want, that kind of means that therefore your true self is found of fulfilling the want. Because it's like, well, in this phenomenological experience, you feel like you should do the thing. Therefore, if you don't do it, you're not being you, right? Mm-hmm. The reason I think this is really important, because in the experience of a temptation, you don't just feel want. You feel a shouldn't do as well as a should do.
Yeah.
And what if the feeling of the temptation is actually your true self is found in the acknowledgement of the shouldn't, because it is different from a want? We just kind of assume that the want side of the temptation is where your true self is found, when the very fact that you feel a shouldn't, there would be just as much reason to think that the shouldn't is what you should give into.
That's interesting.
In order to be your true self, because the identity is ultimately constituted by a mixture of shouldn'ts and shoulds.
Right.
You shouldn't jump off a cliff because you don't have wings. You shouldn't drive a car at 80 miles per hour because that might kill you, right? Like living your life is a mixture of shoulds and shouldn't. And the reason and that's how you stay alive, and that's how you make the most of your life. The reason I think the phenomenological experience of the temptation is really important to focus on is because it brings with it a shouldn't that you have just as much reason to think. And frankly, since the shouldn't doesn't appear in the pure want, the very fact that it's unique in that experience would suggest that that's what you should listen to, not the should. But there's always this assumption that the should is where your true self will be found.
Maybe the reason why people fall into the should is more my true self than the shouldn't is because shouldn't would look like not doing something.
Yeah.
But the thing is that not doing something is actually still an action too.
Yes.
It's just not.
Well, if you don't eat the ice cream, you're going to go outside. There's going to be other action you do.
But this is why I think it's such a focus. It's such a pigeonholing of the focus, right? Because it almost makes it out to be like you literally didn't do anything unless you indulge that temptation. When really you're going to go and indulge going outside.
Yeah, you're going to do something.
Now
else.
maybe though you'd be like, well, it's not indulging because I don't really. It's not really like I'm having this craving and desire to go outside necessarily. I mean, I think going outside is great.
It's action. It's not inaction.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, we assume that the temptation is... The assumption is that the temptation is unveiling to you that identity is found in want. When really, perhaps the revelation of temptation is that identity is found in the mixture of the will and the want, and finding a balance between those things.
Well, what if somebody said okay, that's good, Daniel, but if I just sort of unquestioningly accept that all the shouldn'ts are also my true self, and that's so therefore it's I should just not fall into the temptation and be like myself, and but then but it's still there for them, and then then they kind of have a midlife crisis in their 40s and they start.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. I mean, because there's this idea that sometimes the thing you think you shouldn't do, you should do, and sometimes the thing you think you should do, you shouldn't do, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Basically, what I want to argue, so for example, if you're running a race, the temptation is to stop running. You shouldn't stop running. That's bad. But in that example, you go, but my true self wants to stop running, therefore I have to be true to myself and should stop running. Mm-hmm. Everyone would kind of laugh and know that's ridiculous. But then there are examples where not doing something that you want to do is good, right? But on other situations, what if you were brought up in a family where you're made to feel like talking with people of a different ethnic group or maybe using a technology is bad? And so you're tempted to watch TV, right? And so actually it's kind of like, well, no, it's okay to watch TV. There's nothing wrong with TV. It depends on what you watch. But you're kind of raised to think that TV is evil or something. Or maybe you're brought up to think that all liberals are evil and you should never talk to them and so on. So in those examples, doing what you think you, fighting the feeling that you shouldn't do something should be good. Basically, what I want to argue is that this whole idea of judging what you should or shouldn't do based on the feeling you have that you should or shouldn't do it needs to be thrown off the table. Or at least it needs to be in a concert of other variables. What really should be your primary is like the external world. Like really paying attention to the external world. You are in a race. Your teammates are relying on you not to stop. Therefore, even if you feel like you want to stop, you shouldn't. The ice cream on the counter has a lot of calories in it. Ice cream is not healthy for you because of the sugar. You shouldn't eat it. But then there's the objective where we say, well, I don't eat it often. Since I don't eat it often, it's okay to eat it often here. So I think what's kind of important is to really not address temptations. Like if you have a hesitancy about something, to then view it in objective terms, like really focus on the external world and the consequences that will come with that, of which the whole reason you're focusing on it is because of something you feel, so your feelings are a relevant variable here. The whole reason you're thinking about the ice cream is because of your feelings, or the girl, or the date, or whatever. But you see what ends up happening is like you're almost trained now to just stay within your own internal system to make the decision, as opposed to moving outside of it and then operating dialectically with the external world to determine what's best or what's not best.
Yeah, that's good. And that's, I think, looking at I think just to take a little bit of a pause and really think about, like, what is it exactly that I'm, feel tempted by?
Yes.
What is it?
Yes.
What in what way do I want to, like, satisfy it?
Yes.
Is this actually a temptation or a want? Is my should feeling accurate, or my shouldn't feeling accurate? Where is it coming from? Is it literally just, me feeling shamed for wanting to wear, I don't know, like for wanting to wear a calf-length dress or something? I don't know.
The key is we assume that your true self is found in the should, when it could be the case that your true self is found in the shouldn't.
But we're also saying, though, like, if you're talking like that example you're saying about, if you were always made to feel like you're ashamed or...
Yes, so you pay attention to the objective reality of the TV, not to your upbringing. You really...
like, what exactly... the thing that you're feeling tempted toward, what exactly is that?
Yeah. Yes, to really put the emphasis on the is.
And what would it really mean? Like, what would it really mean, the consequences of, whatever... doing that thing.
Yeah, what are the consequences? Like, because this idea that you have a true self, like, sometimes that's kind of dangerous, because it's like your true self is this thing you have to find when really you're creating it.
Yeah, you're creating it constantly.
Yeah.
Another thing too, I mean, with this whole idea of, like, I guess the concept of the 40-year-old, midlife crisis in your 40s or whatever, could come from this idea of, like, of constantly suppressing your temptations or something.
Sure.
And maybe you could even bring in the term avoidance or something. I don't know.
Sure.
Because, in being tempted, if you don't acknowledge it or something, if you just completely don't even give it time. Like, I think the thing is, though, it doesn't mean you have to go and do the temptation necessarily, because it could truly be something you shouldn't do.
Sure.
But I think if you acknowledge what it is and maybe give yourself time and space to, I don't know, I mean, even just to think about it, to write it out, to maybe read further on that, like to really just maybe even like research it, like and then also acknowledge what it represents and the larger thing it represents. Then you can, I think it's like you're not ignoring it and you're not just pretending it's not there, but you're not just like, I think we only think of in temptations, like our only engagement with it is either to like deny it or to indulge it.
Well, it depends on what you mean by temptation, because, like, usually, like, there's the difference between the society says being a writer is stupid, and you feel like you should be a writer, but the society says you shouldn't, and so you don't, and you don't acknowledge it, and then you're 40 and it comes out of you. Is that a temptation? You see, I think one of the reasons why, or is that, you very often, like, I think in a lot of the language that people use about being your true self, like, there's a lot of terms that are kind of conflated together. Like, when you have a social order that says you shouldn't do something, but you feel like you should, is that a temptation situation, or is that like the social givens or the oppression of the order, right?
Sure.
In that situation, I'm not sure if the issue is it involves a want. So it seems like a temptation because there's a want that is denied, or there's this idea that maybe I should deny the want, maybe I shouldn't. Oh, you're right, I'll be a writer and I'll never make any money, and so yeah, I should deny that. But that seems different than sort of the temptation of you're in a race and you want to stop running, you know, and then it seems to be also tied to the like there's something about purpose here. Like you're on a race, the point of a race is to finish it.
Yeah.
Therefore, you shouldn't give in to the feeling to stop running.
Right.
And you know, the purpose is, if you're on a cross-country team, is to be there for your teammates.
Sure.
Well, likewise, so it's like, what is your purpose in life, right? So what is your purpose? You say, well, my purpose is to be a writer. Okay, well, then you need to go against what other people are saying, right? Mm-hmm. You need to not repress that desire to be a writer because that's relative to your purpose. But then the temptations would actually be, the temptation would be to give in to the social order as opposed to be a writer. So purpose is really critical.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think purpose is very important because I think it will definitely give a better barometer to, is this a temptation or not? Or is it actually the opposite? Like, is it
versus
actually
just feeling. I feel like I want to do it, therefore I should. That's kind of an emotional judgment, as we talk about in a paper. Like, I feel like I want to do it, therefore, you know, it's good.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the thing is, like, if it's something where, I think that sometimes temptations often are also just because they are the temporary things. They always present themselves as more novel.
Yes.
And I think something that could help in if somebody truly is dealing with the temptation for something, I mean, kind of going a little bit back to the unforbidden pleasures, but it's like you have to recognize, I guess for me, I kind of like have this challenging thought of, like, I guess in the sense that maybe it's stubborn. It's challenging in a stubborn sense where it's like, can't I just wonder if there could be the same kind of, like, electric vibe of temptations, of what a temptation sometimes makes one feel. Could one find that or cultivate that in what is not forbidden? You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, part of the reason of temptation is because of adrenaline. Like there's a come up like an adrenaline where you know you shouldn't do it, so there's adrenaline. So one of the issues, if it's unforbidden, it's more common, it's more accessible, so it's harder to cultivate the adrenaline.
Well, I think a lot of times, like, maybe the temptation is, it's even tempting because it makes you feel like more alive, or it makes you feel more, and so it's like, could you cultivate a sense of really a feeling actually of like that reinvigoration of life in the things you're doing day in, day out, like in the things that are just already happening that aren't
you certainly
temptations.
Can, but,
you know what I mean?
They have to be built. They have to be constructed, and they have to be risen to that place. I mean, there are thrills that happen for one who develops a craft for an extended time and then gets to the place where they develop something truly extraordinary, and there are certain thrills that come from achieving that. But that's the thing, right? Like the temptation, the thrill is here now. It's like immediate. And so it's just there.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is then to make it through life. You know, people talk about how in life, life used to have so much passion and now it doesn't. You know, all these movies are just so boring, you know, the doing it again and all these different things. Well, because what ends up happening is, like, earlier in life, a lot of, like, the thrills are on the front end. But then, like, as you get older, to find thrill and adrenaline, you have to build it. You have to work toward it. Like, it's on the back end and different things. And they do become wonderful. But I think that also gets into the ability to cultivate we talk about the aesthetic sensibility.
Right.
To see beauty in everything around you.
Well, yeah, I was thinking about how I wonder if, I remember, like, this particular trip that I made, and anyways, it's a long story, but the point is that this trip made me encounter death a lot more, like, or proximity to death.
Yeah.
And not for myself, but seeing other people
Sure.
in that place. And it's funny because it almost made me, I was like, I don't know, my late teens or something,
Sure.
and it made me really kind of want to, like, I don't know, like, go, and I wasn't even like a partier, but I was like, I want to go to, like, parties and
Right.
dance with a boy, and I don't know, just silly
Right.
things, and like things that, because I was like, was that life? And there's like, there's so much like life in that.
Yes.
So I guess what I mean to say is like, if what around you is kind of in some ways symbols of death,
Sure.
I think that temptations become a lot more appealing.
Yes,
because,
absolutely.
Because you feel like you're running to them, and that's actually avoidance then, right? Because you're not
Yes.
really facing the death and the life, the rebirth of
Yes.
life itself.
Yes.
You're kind of running to that as the escape, right?
You don't find, to the question, you don't find any religious teachings that describe virtue and morality as having the same appeal as temptation. They all talk about virtue and different things as things that the appeal to them are earned. The appeal to them develop. Perhaps that's precisely why the good is so difficult.
Yeah.
It does seem to have an innate disadvantage to the things that are quote unquote temptations in the way so being described.
Yeah, well, and I think that, well, I know, well, it just makes me think of like one of our other conversations, where we were talking about, sort of like, we were talking about inception, but really the idea of cultivating your own quiet expressions, etc.
Yes.
Like, I think that if we lose the depth and the richness of our own minds and the minds of those around us, I guess what I mean to say is like, if everything kind of unfortunately stays in like a very superficial
Yes.
or shallow,
Yes.
then no wonder the temptations are the only thing that make you feel alive, because
Absolutely.
everything else is just like, you feel like an automaton or something
Well,
like that.
referencing that conversation, we said that so much you're kind of trained to think of everything as like or dislike.
Exactly.
And that gets tied into, you want to do it, it's your true self. You don't want to do it, it's not your true self.
Right.
And so then everything
What if someone's like, well, I want to do both. I want to do the day in, day out, the kind of quiet, simple,
Yes.
but I also really just like, I'm so tempted by like those, daredevil types of like experiences, or like, or lust, or whatever they are.
Then you should focus on what is the thing that you are tempted to do. Is it skydiving? I don't know if that's the same as like,
sleeping with
an
other
adult,
people
yeah,
or
like
something.
an affair.
Right,
Like,
exactly.
The problem is a lot of times this language of like being your true self with wants is so general. It's
And that's the
overfitting.
thing. It's kind of like, could you maybe, the
skydiving, facing your fear in skydiving, or doing the adrenaline to go dirt biking may indeed help you discover something about yourself.
Go skydive. Like, I guess it's just gotta like make a place for that, if that's like something that maybe you're just
Yes.
put on your flying squirrel suit and jump off that cliff. Like you were saying before. Like, I think there's something. Obviously you have to make that decision. Only the person themselves could know if they're doing that just to escape their life, which they
Yes.
aren't.
Yeah, that's right. Only they
Or
can
not.
know.
Yeah, only they can know. But the thing is, it's like, just because it's something that is like a flash or whatever,
Yes.
does not necessarily mean it's something bad or wrong, or that
But that's why we need to focus on the thing.
on the thing itself.
Yeah.
And maybe the thought is like, I think like having particular outlets.
Yes.
If you struggle with some temptation,
Yes.
then figure out a healthy outlet for that in a
Yes.
way that truly is healthy, and like doesn't go against your values and your virtues and your
and again,
and to be able to say like that outlet, and then you have to really be like scrutinize that though. Is that truly a healthy outlet or not? Like, is it?
There is a radical difference between, say, a temptation to be in a fair,
Mm-hmm.
a temptation to eat ice cream, and a temptation to to watch TV if you grew up in a religious community that made it out to be that TV's always evil, or the temptation to stand up to your mother or something, and you grew up in an area where everything your mother does is right or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem with the word temptation is it's kind of like we talk about overfitting and underfitting.
Yeah.
In computer science, and it's the idea that like people are using the term temptation to say they're overfitting it. They're saying, I'm tempted in X situation, therefore I'm tempted in X situation to do Y, therefore my true self is found in Y. That it's really not a very useful formula at all, because it's so relative to the particulars. And frankly, using your wants as a heuristic for decision making is really should be very low down your list. It really, well, let me put it this way: the fact you want to do it should be the reason you are considering it, and that's about it. Like, you're considering it because you want to do it. Okay, That's a given. Like, your focus is here. It is the justification and direction of your focus.
Yeah.
But that's it. That's the role it plays to determine what you think about. But as a factor in the making the decision about that thing, it doesn't really function very well. It doesn't really do much. You have to, like, look at what the thing is. What are the consequences? What is the cost-benefit analysis? Like, there are far better mental models to be using than want or diswant, because maybe in X situation it's avoidance, maybe in Y situation it helps you find your true self, maybe in Z situation it's tearing down the social order. So you have to read. But if you have a society that hasn't trained philosophical reasoning, philosophical discernment, well, then you don't have people that can do that. And so then, of course, and then if they've been incepted and trained to think in terms of like or dislike, well, then they've been trained to use wants and temptations as heuristics, when really they are simply they're the beginnings of thought, I guess I want to say. Like, they're the starts of thought. But they do nothing more than start. Like, they can't have any other function than be what start the thinking and the thought. And then you have to go into other mental actions, mental models, different other ways of analysis.
What if one feels like a failure in being tempted, and maybe they like succumb mentally or something like that to some temptation or something like that?
Sure. It depends on what the thing is. Like, what level of guilt is healthy, what level of guilt is unhealthy. Is guilt another corollary to this is people assume all guilt is bad. Well, if you, like, cheated on your wife, you should feel guilty, right? Is that really bad? You know, if you killed someone, you should feel guilty. Is that really bad?
Yeah.
But if you eat a small taste of ice cream on your diet, should you, like, hate yourself?
Well, I guess I'm just thinking, like, if we think from like
guilt is another one that overfit. It's not it depends. Like, guilt is not always bad. It depends.
Right. It's not always it right, exactly. It does depend. I guess I'm just thinking, like, I don't know, if we think about scripturally with this idea of, like, well, even if you look, you know, if you
sure,
like, what I think that there is obviously there's a reason for why that is mentioned, and I think that's because often it can train the mind to, like I was saying before, always so focused on the forbidden fruit that that's all you see or all you look for, right? And that's why even to look upon, like, you know, as it says, like, to look upon a woman, that can still be, you know, not so good, you know, because it's kind of like training the mind to always only find pleasure in that. Instead of seeing, oh wow, there's actually a lot to see, and that actually is very, very beautiful and very good. But I guess I'm just, like, for example, like, there's a part of me, though, that also doesn't think that scripture is meant to say, like, to find someone beautiful is necessarily, like,
no,
wrong,
covetousness.
really.
No, not at all. Lewis has some work on that. Yes.
Yeah. You know, it's kind of like you can acknowledge beauty in somebody, for example, or something that you admire, like some trait you admire or something like that. But it's right. I mean, the moment you're kind of coveting or you're you know,
a way to look at that passage, there's a big difference between undressing a woman in your head. You don't undress beauty. Like, when you find something beauty, you want it, you're acknowledging it exactly as it's presenting itself.
Yes.
You know, a lot of covetousness is actually making it fit you're objectifying it.
And like you're filling it in.
Yes, you don't undress beauty. I mean, covetousness is now it's that, like, in the bridge over the river Derna with Fatima, you know, it's a great scene about that where when you find something beautiful, the veil is part of the beauty, so you don't want to remove the veil.
Right, exactly.
So that kind of, in that would be the difference.
Well, and I wonder if this, because I think, like, you know, an example of like, you know, like you said, undressing the woman in your mind, that's actually imagination, right?
Yes.
That's your imagination at play. And I think perhaps, though, we can acknowledge that there's something actually very useful about that, but it's just being used in a direction, like, it could be used in the opposite direction, not in the sense that you could use that imagination to better acknowledge beauty, for example, as she is, you know, as you see her, not undressed, let's say, and then basically utilize that imagination for finding that beauty represented in, say, what is around you.
It is in the same way that it is utterly useless to have as a heuristic, guilt is always bad. it is utterly useless to say imagination is always good or imagination is always bad. That's why these simple models of, you're tempted to do it,
wrong,
like or dislike, it is completely situation dependent. But here's the key. What I'm suggesting requires you to take the world outside of your head seriously. And the whole feeling of modernity is that nothing feels real. Like, that's the whole meaning, right? Like, the whole world, how do I know there's a world out there? Nothing feels real. And so when you exist in a modern world where nothing feels real, and you've also been told that the individual is the center of everything, and how then the only heuristics you have are internal mechanisms. Like, I want to do it, I like to do it, I'm tempted to do it. So then your entire mechanism of making decisions is internally bound. And what I guess I'm saying in this conversation is, if that's all you got, you're in big trouble, because you cannot, in order to like determine if you should eat the ice cream or not, you have to take, I'm saying you take the external world very, very seriously, and you basically make your decision primarily in terms of the external world,
the very
more
tactile
so
world.
than the internal world, because the internal world is primarily has the function of instigating the focus, if you will, and it does of course have a role because you have to think and so on and so forth, but really it's a dialectic between the external and the internal world is the system, is the process by which you make your decisions. But in the modern world, where we don't even feel like the real world is out there, the world isn't real, we feel like heads on sticks, and we don't trust anything we experience or whatever, then our only mechanisms for decision making become internal, and they're inadequate when they are not dialectical. They are completely inadequate.
I wonder too if that makes this kind of, like I was saying, this kind of sort of a little bit more nuanced space of temptations in one's mind even harder, because you kind of are pushed more into your mind in a less real world, basically, in a
absolutely
more image and
completely
fabricated world by not fabricated in the sense that it's not right before you, right? It's somewhere else, but it is before you, but it's not. So there's something that is like illusory to it. And so I wonder if that just pushes people into their minds more, and they kind of get even more stuck there.
Absolutely, because you can't determine what is a valid want from a temptation without focus on the external world. Like, if everything's pushing you into your head, you are being pushed into the realm where you cannot make good decisions exclusively. Like, you have to, good decisions are a result of a dialectic between the internal realm and the external world. You understand what I'm saying? Like, comparing it or thinking it through dialectic, feeding one another. If your entire experience of the world, just like you said, is pushing you internally, then you will not be able to make good decisions.
Yeah, and I think, again, this piggybacks off of what we were talking a bit on with the inception, is that being pushed into your head, you might be like, well, that's great. Here in our minds, we can philosophize more, Sure. But the problem is that we haven't really been equipped with that. So being pushed into one's head just becomes overthinking. It becomes the pinball that's just kind of
good philosophy is not just in the realm of the mind,
ricocheting off one side and the other, and it's just never really accomplishing anything, and there's no rhythm there.
No, good philosophy bounces off the real world. And then back into the mind, and from the mind back into the real world. It's a constant kind of
dialectic between those two.
If you don't have a dialectic, you're in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
And what's happening is now people using the want, I want to do it, therefore it's good. They're basically making decisions without dialectics.
Yeah.
They're making decisions exclusively using internal compasses.
Yes.
And you shouldn't do that. Internal compasses may be right. Internal compasses could be correct.
Yeah.
But the likelihood of them being correct drops like a rock if you don't dialectically bounce them off of the external world, in the same way that if you only make decisions based on the external world and you have no internal resources by which to process your experiences of the external world, the likelihood that you make good decisions will also be quite bad and quite low. It must be dialectical. And a lot of this language that people use of, do you want to do it, or is your true self, push through the temptations because, you find your true self. None of that is very helpful. It's too vague. It doesn't have enough dialectic.
It is too vague, and I think it's also very confusing because
it's extremely confusing.
It's just not very clear.
No, it's completely relative to the situation and other things that can only be taken into serious account by taking the external world seriously.
I will say, I think it's interesting in doing more. I think that in pushing into more of the epistemology and and phenomenology, all of there is something that I do think, I want to say, I don't know if it's like just it develops maybe a muscle to kind of like, let's say there's a temptation, let's just use an analogy of like this image of holding something, okay, and it's the forbidden fruit.
Yes.
I think that it's like it almost there's the muscles develop more so to be able to actually like hold it out or place it down and look at it. And maybe one would say, well, it's just as much of the muscles to like bring it to your mouth and eat it, for example. But there's something about being able to test it more, I should say.
Yes,
throw it up in the air, see what it does, like let it land on the ground, and there's kind of something that I think you are able to test it a bit more, and therefore it actually loses less of its like it's not as. It's not, you have the power now in a sense, not it. It doesn't lord over you. In a sense, you kind of have the power to see what is it. Does it hold water? What is this? And that's good though, because then it doesn't, have this sort of like very oppressive hold on you. You're holding it down to kind of analyze what it is and where it's coming from and what larger does it point to, et cetera, et cetera.
You're holding it down not necessarily to repress it, but to test it.
To test it, exactly.
Yes, and well, I mean, when we talk about philosophy, you're talking about wisdom. And the whole tradition of wisdom is basically not to fall into temptation. And do note, they use the language of, say, temptation versus, like, give particular subjects not to fall into, because like, what's a temptation and what, like, eating an apple in one situation is a temptation and another situation is perfectly fine. So, you always, in a sense, wisdom is the opposite of wisdom is temptation, in a sense. Because, like, temptation is a mode. It's like an orientation to the world where you're kind of examining things that are pulling you. Well, the temptation in regard to that kind of feeling you described that's pulling you in, where you're kind of being pulled in and you can't help yourself, kind of dimension of temptation, which you almost need a new word, like a different term, the pull, we could call it.
Okay.
The pull of temptation. The opposite of the pull of temptation is wisdom. Like, wisdom is the ability not to be pulled, but also not to outright dismiss the thing. You test it, you examine it, you hold it. And you see, the moment you do that, you're holding it back. So it's not holding you forward.
Right.
And so then, you're talking about how it ceases to pull you. Well, because you start moving it out of the realm of emotion to examination. So it gets still. It stops moving and you can look at it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because the image of the fruit and eating it, it's like it actually speaks a lot to the self-discussion in this discussion, because I think a lot of times temptations do present themselves as, if you do this, you'll feel you'll be happy, or you'll be fulfilled, or you'll be yourself, right? Well, the whole idea of just this kind of like automatic no thinking, kind of just eating the forbidden fruit, it's because you want to be one with it, right?
Yes.
You want to satisfy that hunger, and kind of immediately be able to say, like, I'm it's one with me now. Like, I'm with it, and therefore I don't have to worry now if I'm like this apartness.
I mean,
you know what I mean? Like, it's
so wisdom is like the temptation is to, using that language is the temptation is to bridge the separation without first testing it to make sure you should.
Right, and the thing is, like, the risk is that it's a poison apple, right? It's like, right. Or it's something that then is not good for you, and now you're one with it, and that's not good, because now now you can't really get it out of you, right? And so I think, I think the thing is interesting though, because if we allow ourselves to take some time to contemplate, like to have contemplation, in a way you allow that thing to be incorporated into your mind.
Yes, absolutely.
So there's still, I think it's just kind of I don't know if it is kind of a deception in a sense, right? Because it's like trying to make you get this oneness that you could actually achieve in other ways.
Yes, but the other ways come with the work of wisdom and the cultivation of abilities.
Maybe it does seem like wisdom does want to like keep the space for the dialectic, right? Even between you and the fruit, the forbidden fruit you're holding, right? Whereas like the temptation is, the whole idea is just to like not have a dialectic, just make it back into one.
Just jump in and take that Freudian primordial unity.
Exactly.
Temptation is like one.
Which makes sense,
Often temptation is just going straight for the oneness without the work.
Yeah.
Which, hey, Nine
that
out,
sounds
you know,
fun.
9 is great, and then maybe 8 times it's wonderful, but the 2 times it's not could ruin your life.
Yeah, sure.
And you see, the reason why, you know, often we think of the opposite of wisdom as kind of being stupidity or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think it's really critical, like, the opposite, wisdom is primarily this kind of holding back, not letting it pull you, examining, and then choosing it.
Yes.
So, like, there's this act in wisdom where you say, this thing is pulling me, I'm going to push against it to still it.
Right.
Then I'm going to look at it, and then I'll decide if I go with it or if I don't.
Right.
So there's this kind of pushing back to wisdom. Well, the feeling in temptation we're describing is pulling you forward. So that's why
And that does feel very uncontrolled. Like, you
Very
often it's like,
uncontrolled.
I just can't control that. Like, there's
Yes.
just this strange gravity or pull or
Yes.
unseen type of, like, force that's making you
Yeah, and I
drawn
think
to
it's
it.
so critical to understand that the opposite of that pulling you forward is wisdom. Because if you just think of wisdom as being smart, or that the opposite of wisdom is stupidity, you're not really getting at what wisdom is helping you with. You know, wisdom is helping you from being pulled along.
And
by
I think,
life.
too, what's so important with that, what you're saying, Daniel, is that wisdom is not to not feel that pull.
Yeah, exactly. You feel
It's
the
actually
pull.
to feel the pull, but then give your own resistance. So there's
Yes.
this dynamic force going on. And it's not to just completely throw it away. You actually hold it. You can be in the place of holding.
Wisdom,
You know what I mean? To actually look and see, what is this?
wisdom does not say that if it pulls you, you therefore don't do it.
Exactly.
This is key. Just
Yes.
because it tempted you, it does not necessarily follow that it's bad. Just because it pulled you, like you see an amusement park ride, and you're like, I want to do it. You know, that doesn't mean it's bad. The key is that wisdom is the pushing back so that you choose, so that it's your choice.
That it is truly your
That
exactly.
it is truly
that it's
your
truly
choice.
your choice, and not
But this gets why though people don't want wisdom. Because
it's
that means it's
responsibility.
your
Yeah.
responsibility.
And maybe there's also a thought of like, but it's more true if I'm just pulled into it, like falling in love and things like that.
People say that when they conflate the feeling of being free from responsibility with being more true.
That's true.
And people love that conflation. The freedom from very common. People conflate true self with free of responsibility. Because that's what we idealistically, childishly, like, want, you know.
And also, you know, we say that it's like about like, oh, well, we're just being open to the unknown possibilities, and we're just,
Yes.
you know, we're going to allow it
Yes.
to take us. But no. We want the temptation because we know exactly what we
Yes.
know exactly what darn well we want, and
Yes.
what we want to see it as, and what we
Yes.
want it to look
Yes.
like, and what we want
Yes.
it to feel like.
Yes.
So no. This is not you letting yourself get into
Yes.
the unknown mysteries. That's
Yes.
actually more so when you do this dynamic resistance and holding. Because that's more unknown.
If you want to
right?
get into the unknown mysteries, have children. You know, that's how you do
Yes.
it. Like, you discover the unknown mysteries of life by hurling
I
yourself.
can confirm that statement.
Yeah, by committing to things
And
that
that's
you
the thing.
cannot take back.
That's the crazy thing, Daniel. Because
Yes.
the committing to things feels. I think it's just weird how it's gotten this like boring, old news type of feel to it. When really, like, oh golly, that's exactly where you're going to find the unknown mystery and the flashes of surprise and
But that's all
and
kind
things
of
like that.
that's all unfortunately tied in a way to the IC. You know, kind of this negative Hegelian Geist going. So we want to believe.
I heard you use that term with Lou a lot, and I was like, I need him to put that on a piece of paper so I can see. Is he talking about like an icy, like from 7-Eleven?
Oh,
Because
that's
I
really
like those
funny.
things
That's
sometimes.
really funny.
Is that
But-
a temptation that I want an icy from
Well,
7-Eleven?
you know, it depends on how much it costs and if it's good and if it
my
makes you sick. You got to pay attention to the objective world, right?
Yeah, I
You
guess
know?
I do.
But there is something that, yeah, we want to, kind of in a energy-saving, egotistical, saving ourselves from struggle way, we want to believe that true self is found from the absence of responsibility, the absence of thought, the absence of commitment. Because if that's the case, then we find our true self in doing the easy things. So how wonderful if we can come up with some philosophy or some metaphysics or some secular schema, it doesn't matter, that says just that. You know, how wonderful if we can come up with some way to justify that way of thinking. And so that's what we've done. But it's problematic because then wisdom is basically indistinguishable from giving in to the pull. You know, it becomes indistinguishable. You're wise if you follow your pull. You're wise to give in to temptations. You're wise to follow your wants blindly. That's what ends up happening in the world today. The wise person just does what they want because that's where you find your true self. And literally
it's kind of like it's a hollowed out wisdom then. You know?
Literally that means if in fact the pulling you of temptation is the opposite of wisdom, then literally that means today wisdom is defined as anti-wisdom.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, so that's what's happened today.
I think that's fair, and I want to just bring this up really quick as a side note to bring back the word shame, because I think it's a big part of temptation, honestly, because I know that you said it's like the result of if you do the temptation, but the whole reason why you feel like you shouldn't is because you feel like that would be a shame, right? It would be shameful to do it. Right?
It can be, yes.
So I think because the thing is that a lot of times I think I wonder sometimes because I think shame does have, like, it's like you said, right? Shame is both good and bad. It depends on the context. It depends on how it's being used, right?
Yes.
But I think a lot of times people do just get the sense of like, that's bad, you shouldn't, and you should be ashamed that you even thought of that, like that you even wanted that.
Sure, I mean those things go together. Yes.
Yeah, and the thing is though, I think that's a very common experience for people with temptation, though, in terms of having some figure kind of guide them through their temptation feeling, possibly. If we think about this from different possible authority figures, and it's like the risk with that, though there is a place for shame, and there can be something both useful and hurtful with shame, but the risk there is that you don't ever really think through it.
Yes, that's correct.
I mean, the beauty of having like a conversation about this and then philosophy in general for understanding temptation is that, it's not just like this, I don't know, it's strange. I think that it's too much actually like temptation to just immediately reject the like, just, it's like you're always just taught, well, you better not even touch that, right? And it's like, obviously if it's a fire, then yes,
that's not wisdom, but because wisdom will examine. Wisdom
will take it to contemplate and say, well, what is this, and why do I want it, and what larger disappointed it. So it's just, I guess what I mean to say is that it's weird because I think there's something kind of ironic in our approach and our almost quote unquote treatment of temptation, because it's almost a temptation. It's the temptation nature, which is to do the automatic and the
Yes, well, because then
and I think unfortunately that does not equip people to handle temptation later on in their lives, because
it makes it worse.
It makes it worse, exactly.
Yes, because it's the only way.
And then it makes it even more alluring because you're always like, I couldn't even like touch that forbidden fruit apple for a second because I'm just a bad person, and it's like, yes, maybe it is something that would be a bad thing to do, but it doesn't really give you the contemplation space to realize why it's a bad would be a bad thing to do, or what there is.
If wisdom is in fact the pushing back.
Yeah.
And the opposite of that is the pulling forward, then the way you resist temptation is developing the ability to push back. If you're never allowed to think of something, you can never develop the ability to push back, because you're never thinking about it, so you never exert a pushback, so you never learn the wisdom. So then that...
Or maybe you're like, I am pushing back, I'm not even thinking about it, I'm not even allowing myself to think about it.
The absence of resistance is not pushing back. You have to hold out. For me to push against your hand, if I'm pushing through the air, there's nothing there. You have to hold out your hand, and I push against it to be pushing back.
I see. That's a good point.
So, you literally, people, what ends up happening is people are trained to deal with temptation in a manner that makes them unable to resist it. So, like, in the same way there's a concern of avoidance, you can actually kind of be avoiding the conditions that can develop wisdom. In fear, and then you're kind of giving into fear.
I think that's a good point, that a lot of times shame and fear are very linked together.
Yes.
And that the problem with that is that it doesn't allow for that dynamic place of resistance. Where you feel the push and you feel the pull and then you feel the push, right?
Yes.
And so the very mechanism of how we're taught to deal with temptation is often not equipping you to actually deal with temptation.
It makes you fragile. It contributes to fragility, and then when people inevitably find out they're fragile, then they can have a total collapse, or then they'll go, they'll start giving in to every temptation or whatever. It becomes problematic. And it's just very critical to understand that, when we talk about some temptation, I mean, you can get into sex and different things like that. It's like, if you're led to think that it's a shame to think of sex, well, then you never think about how one should engage in sex or in what context sex is good or different things. And so then the likelihood of ending up doing something shameful, say objectifying people through sex, which is shameful, well, the likelihood you do that becomes higher.
Yes.
Precisely because you weren't allowed to think about the subject of sex so that you could form wise opinions about it. So that's a reason why it's so critical to locate wisdom and shame in terms of orientation, not in terms of things, because then you go through life like, what are the things I shouldn't think about? You externalize the problem as opposed to thinking about you. Like, what are you doing? Like, how are you thinking? What are you thinking about? What is your disposition?
And what are you doing?
Sex? Yeah, like if you can solve your problem just by avoiding sex, well, then all you have to do is avoid sex. But if, like, no, that's not how you solve it. It's about being wise in sex, or wise in the world, or wise. Well, then you have to think much more profoundly. Because you have to go into the intricacies of sex, or being in the world, or things like that.
Yeah, and I mean, just that point about, the subject itself. There's no really, there's no subject that is in itself wrong. Sex itself is a very good thing.
No, evil's a misordered good.
Right, it's a misordered good of that. When yes. Like you said, if somebody is objectifying another person.
Right.
So it's just interesting because the just kind of outright extricating almost certain subjects as like
off limits.
Exactly, like.
Well, and then look, and the emphasis in psychoanalysis in different fields about saying, look, face your temptations, don't run from your temptations. In the sense that they mean that is good. But to create a heuristic that says if you want to do it is therefore good, that's problematic because it's not dialectical. I mean, basically,
and there's a lack of thought on either side of those ditches. There's a ditch on either side of the road, and both of those are thoughtless in a sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of the problem is a lot of the language of the forbidden fruit. That it comes from Eden, Garden of Eden, and different things like that. And what's really, I mean, what's problematic is, like, it wasn't forbidden for the tree to be there. The fruit was itself not forbidden. It was allowed to be there. In some way, if it was in the Garden of Eden, then it was part of the harmony of the garden. It had some kind of role. The what was forbidden is the bite, is eating from the tree. The action, the way that the fruit was observed. And you see, the issue is we really should... Because when we talk about forbidden fruits, then we're thinking, what is a forbidden fruit? We're thinking of there are forbidden things out there that we should avoid. When really there are forbidden bites. Nothing that exists is bad in of itself. The question is how we relate to it and how we organize. And if sex equals objectification, then it's bad. Then it's a forbidden bite. But sex itself is not forbidden. There is nothing so I think the language of forbidden fruits has become problematic. I mean, there's some language, like with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's only meant for God. Like, only God is supposed to know that. So it's, the fruit, maybe the fruit is like the highest fruit around. It was the only, it was meant for God exclusively. But if man ate it, then it was really bad, because now there's two gods, and by definition there can't be, and they have to be banished from the garden. But this language of forbidden fruit then makes us go around looking for thinking that there are forbidden things.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really tremendous point, because like you said, the fruit itself is not forbidden unto itself. It's not as if it's there, but it's hiding. It's it's just there. It's out there in the open, like fruit is.
It's somehow part of the harmony of Eden.
Yes, and it's very much necessary and very much a part of Eden.
Yes,
and the harmony and the purity of the garden.
Yes.
So it's not like the fruit itself is bad.
Unless God's just making something there to be bad. Why would God make something to be? If God makes it, it's good. So somehow the tree of the good of the knowledge of good and evil is good.
That is a mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's good. The fruit is good. What God made is good. But it was not good for man to eat of it.
And that's what's so interesting. It's it's not the forbidden fruit. Really, it's like a misnomer.
Bite. Yes,
right. It's a forbidden bite. Yeah, and that's that puts so much more of the emphasis rightly on
us.
Right, on the person themselves and what they are doing with said subject.
It's all about the relation.
Yes, exactly. Like, how are they engaging with that said, fruit?
Yeah, because, if there are no forbidden subjects, if there are no forbidden fruits, there's only forbidden bites per se. There's only sins per se.
Yeah.
Well, then the whole name of the game becomes self-work. The whole name of the game becomes developing wisdom in your own capacities to figure out that you're ordering yourself rightly with the world, and that you're rightly ordered. But if there's forbidden fruits and there's no forbidden bites, basically that's what you're led to think. There's no forbidden bites, there's forbidden fruits.
Yeah.
Well, then the whole name of the game becomes learning what to avoid.
Exactly, and then it's all just, an avoidance trap.
Yes, and then you're fragile. Like Nassim Taleb. Then you're always fragile, you're always avoiding, and you're never doing self-work because you don't think you need to do self-work, because why do you need self-work? Because you're avoiding the bad things, so you don't need to worry about anything. Like, you only need to do self-work if you're, like, in the presence of the bad thing, right? Yeah. Like, if there's forbidden subjects, then you need the self-work if you're in their presence, but if you're doing the holy thing and avoiding them or whatever, well, then there's no role of self-work or self-development or getting wisdom.
That's interesting. I wonder, though, if the tension that people feel in being in the presence of the, let's just use this misnomer of the unforbidden fruit, in a sense that misnomer, then maybe they're like, but I am doing self-work because I'm really having to not eat it.
Well, correct, but actually the self-work, there is self-work, but the self-work is the bite. You have to do the self-work not to take the bite. It's not, you think it's the thing itself that you're avoiding, but it's your action toward it that you're doing the self-work to make sure you don't give into.
It's a very subtle
difference that changes everything.
Yeah, right. Because the thing is, it's like you kind of feel like you're already, I think...
There has to be a subject in the sense that you can't bite air. So it's easy to make this mistake.
Yes.
Because there has to be a thing you're relating to in a disordered manner.
Right.
So it's easy to locate the mistake, per se, in the subject, in the thing, but the mistake is found in the relation. But relations are invisible.
Yes.
So that's why it's so easy to make this mistake. Because the relation is not what you observe. You review subject. You observe subjects, things, so it becomes easy to think that it's the thing that's forbidden, when really it's a certain kind of relation with the thing that's forbidden.
Yeah, golly. Well, see, I could see the thing is, I think that maybe there's this kind of misidentification of work, right?
Yes.
And so, but the emphasis is so much more on the subject and not yourself.
Yes.
That, like, what you're doing, what you're cultivating, that it seems like, like you said, it is very fragile, right? Because they're like, heaven forbid I stumble upon that forbidden fruit. Oh God, then it's like, then it's just, then
you're just pulled in or whatever.
Exactly. Or alternatively, and this is where it becomes this very volatile situation, right? Because you're trying so dang hard not to encounter it, but then you do, and then you're like, oh, you just fall into the temptation, and then you're like, no, I feel so bad, and there's all the self-loathing. And instead of just realizing, like, well, no, you can't always control exactly, like, if you cross paths, right, with, like, the forbidden, the quote-unquote misnomer of the forbidden fruit or not. But what you can control is, what you do have something that you can practice, I'll say, because even the language of control can get very steeped in, like, a lot of the fear and shame, the fear-shame dynamic. But this idea of, like, you can actually cultivate yourself for what you want to bite.
Yes.
Right? And if you bite at all or not. I mean, obviously, there's going to be some type of biting.
That becomes the whole name of the game. Is like
that way you're not fragile. You're not just like a victim, basically, to what, I mean, not that, but there can be a victim mentality, I think, to temptation, where you kind of feel like, well, it wasn't my fault, because it
it was just pulled me.
Right, but
it was
it's like,
forbidden fruit, and I was walking down the street, and I ran into a forbidden fruit, and what could I do? I mean, I didn't, there it was. I mean, you're pulled in.
Right, and it's like, but if we put the emphasis more on what, cultivating the self versus the forbidden fruit itself, the forbidden bite, then we realize, like, oh, it's not really about it doing anything to me. It doesn't do anything to me. The forbidden fruit on the tree doesn't do anything.
No.
It's literally hangs there,
Yes.
It's not doing a thing.
All it does is give you the possibility of biting it.
But it doesn't do anything.
But it doesn't do it. Yes, it just in itself has that possibility. So it's in the relation. So you can't just put it all in the subject.
Yes, it's in the relation to that subject.
And it's also theoretically possible to relate to it in a good way. In the same way there's a bad way. So therefore...
Yes, you can relate to it both good and bad, in both good and bad ways.
So therefore, if good and badness are found in relations, well then there's no thing that's good or bad, and that means everything can be either good or bad based on how you relate to it.
Yes.
So then everything becomes about the relation, which means it becomes about the internal resources and the internal capacities to create the relation. And what is the relation with in this circuit? It's a relation with the outside world and therefore dialectical. So then it comes back to the dialectical thing. Like, if it's all relational, then it's dialectical and it's informing one another. The experience of the fruit gives you an opportunity to resist it and grow your ability to resist it, for example, which you're only able to do because you had done the self-work beforehand, and then it feeds back and forth, then you go into the next situation. There's this dialectical growth and development that could occur.
Right.
If you locate the source of good and evil in the relationship and not the subject, and if you realize that everything is either good or evil, not necessarily one or the other. It's always a potential space. And if it's always a potential space that is realized relative to you and your choices and what you choose to do, then cultivating yourself to make sure you do the right choices, to think the right way, becomes paramount. It becomes your critical concern. And that's why this whole heuristic of just making decisions based on your internal resources of wanting to do it or not wanting to do it is so horrific, because if that's how you live your life and make your decisions, you never ever develop the internal resources by which to make relations be good versus bad.
All the while thinking you're using...
All the while thinking you're being wise because you're giving in to your wants.
Right, and all the while thinking that you are thinking about it.
Yes.
You know, because you're like, well, I'm thinking about if I want it or don't want it.
Yes.
I mean, and that's where, you know, with the inception concept and dichotomies and freedom, where, you know, it's like if you only ever... The problem with the ditch on either side of the road, where it's just like you just give in to the temptation, or you just completely, you know, don't even allow yourself to even think for a second about it, otherwise you're like some despicable person, is that both of those are like thoughtless, right? But it's like you still kind of throw yourself into a very volatile, fragile position of like kind of thinking about it in a very unproductive manner.
Yes.
You know, it's kind of like the pinball, like we talked about, like just kind of ricocheting around in your head, versus it being like, well, let me just kind of do the pull and pushback resistance, which then develops strength, where then you have the pinball kind of, you know, allowing this energy transfer back and forth in a metronomic type of way, where there's actually some sort of rhythm and a building to understanding, well, why do I want this thing, and what is it, and you know, what's good about it, what's bad about it, in what way could I do this that isn't bad, that maybe could be, you know, I could still, maybe this is a good thing I want, and maybe I could even do this, and I could do it in this way, and it would not be, you know, actually bad at all. And then also to be able to say, like, to have that place of contemplation to say, like, well, you know, what's interesting too with the bite is that, you know, when you realize that too, that it's the forbidden bite, it's like you can, I don't know, I guess it makes it very, again, it's so less focused on the again, the misnomer of the unforbidden food, because it's like, there's actually a lot you can go and like bite. You know, there's and that's like, I mean, again, with the Garden of Eden, where there's actually a ton of fruits, there's a ton of things you can eat, and I think often it does get a bad rap, like as if somehow that, you know, that fruit itself was bad, right? But it really wasn't. It was, and that's the thing. It's almost like, and maybe there's this kind of
God
resistance.
Only makes good. God can't make bad things, so the tree had to be good.
And maybe it's like, well, but why? Why can't I just like have this one thing? Like, I'm just asking for this one thing. But that's the thing. It's so focalized. I think the problem with why that is such a problematic mindset of like, well, gosh darn it, I just want to have one little bite of this. You know, why can't I have this one thing? Why are you saying it's like not good for me to have this? Well, it's like, there's almost, I guess what I mean to say is like, the thing that's bad is that it's like a hyper-focalization, which actually blinds you to so many of the other things. It's almost like a symbol for that.
Oh yeah,
you
absolutely.
know, and that's what's so important about understanding and being able to take the time to like really look at it and realize, like, wait a second, let me not have it right by my face where I just, you know, I'm eating it, but really like to have it at a distance to say, oh wow, actually that puts all the garden into perspective, where I realize, oh wow, actually no, it's that focalization problem that I think it almost represents, the symbol.
Well, one of the attributes of wisdom is to be skeptical of anything that makes everything else invisible.
Yes.
You know, anything that makes everything else invisible, the wise person is skeptical of.
Yes.
Precisely because it does that.
But maybe, and that's why it's often an escape, right?
Yes.
I mean, because people are like, I just can't handle, like, I need to escape from, I want everything else to be invisible.
Yes, that's right.
And that's why, like, so much of it it's wild because, you know, again, gardens are always such beautiful metaphors in general, but it's like, you know, it's not the ability for the whole garden has to kind of be doing what it needs to do, like being tended to
Yes.
and nourished, because that's when you're going to see, like, there's not just this power in this focalized
Yes.
thing that then makes everything else invisible because everything else is dying and dead and dry, and you know what I mean?
Yes.
So the well springs that are around you are so important, and I think you can find that. But I think, unfortunately, like, say somebody really wants to kind of have more, you know, deeper discussions, for example, and like really finds joy in that, but they just don't find an avenue for that.
Yeah.
I could understand how that would make perhaps make temptations even all the more alluring, when really at the end of the day, the thing that's wanted there could actually be met in a different way or in a different context.
Well, I mean, if you feel like in your life there is constantly temptations, then what that should be evidence to you is not that you should do those things that you're tempted to do necessarily, but that there might be something else that you are not taking initiative on, that you need to take initiative on, because there are various energies inside of you, per se, that are looking for a release. That you need to direct it. So, for example, like, exactly. Like, if you're somebody who wants to have deep conversations, but you're not having them, then other things can become tempting. But rather than assume that what you're supposed to do to be your true self is to give in to those temptations, step back and say, well, maybe I'm feeling these temptations because I'm not taking initiative, or I'm not going out and looking for ways to find those deep conversations and different things. So, but that's just further reason why the heuristic that temptation equals thing you should do to be your true self is so useless as a heuristic. It's much more nuanced. It depends. And but unfortunately, you're made to feel wise to give in to those temptations. Like, there's kind of to give in to your to do what you want to do is now considered wise, because that's how you find your true self.
Well, right, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true, and that's you know, can be very problematic, because I think at the end of the day, though, then you're not yourself. You're all these wants. And then it's even more like of an identity crisis at the end of the day.
Well, right. Unfortunately, all deceits have to feel like revelations, or otherwise they wouldn't be convincing. So, you know, this deception that your true self equals doing whatever you want feels like a big philosophical revelation and truth, and that's why it can be deceptive. You don't have a true self that you find. It's more like Hegel's absolute. You have an absolute self that you make relative to your choices now, that is brought out by your past choices, but they're all symbiotically creating one another. We have absolute selves more than we have true selves. And the absolute self that you have often actually is greater by overcoming the temptation to stop in the race. And critically, if indeed it's the forbidden bite, then then the name of to bring out your absolute self, to use that language, is found not in avoiding fruits or avoiding subjects, but learning how to relate to them correctly. Everything becomes about relating correctly, which means you also have to be able to discern the particularities of the person you were relating to. The external world, to go back to what we were saying at the beginning, under this schema, the external world becomes extremely real and extremely important to take into consideration, because that is the thing you're relating to. And if everything, so the thing you are relating to is by definition the external world. And so suddenly it's very real, and suddenly learning to relate to it is the source of good and evil, not random subjects like fruits. Like, this is the other problem. We're led to believe that, like, evil comes from, like, subjects, like things. But no, it comes from misordered relations.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, just as you said, where it's like the idea of, like, to be your true self, you just need to, you know, not avoid your temptations and, you know, do them. Well, that ultimately, it actually makes a much more concretized self, right?
Yes.
Which then isn't a real self.
Yes.
And the same can be said if we want to just give a little tiny airtime to the alternative, right? The other ditch on the other side of the road, where you say, well, basically just to always say that whatever as long as I don't do what I want, right? Like, always basically
that's Puritanism.
Right. And I know that's but just to give it a little airtime, like if you always vilify your wants, for example, and you say, like, well, It's just, I'm going to be defined, I'm
Yes.
going to be the person I am. I'm going to be my true self by always denying my wants. Well,
You're still only using the internal resources. Like we said, you have to have a dialectic
With the external
with
world.
the external world.
right, and you're still kind of, again, that's a concretized self.
Yes.
Which again could be the ego too.
Because you're
right?
defining
You're-
yourself in terms of wants alone.
Right, you're exactly either whether you deny them or whether you indulge them. So it's
Yes.
like wants is your heuristic, and that's not dynamic enough, and it's not again, like you said, wants need to be the starting point.
Starting
They're
point.
not the end all and be all of
No.
what your
We're
decision
literally
should be.
telling people to finish their races at the starting line.
It's like,
like-
guys, we just started this thing.
Yeah,
you
we're
know?
literally telling them that the starting line is the finish line, and then we wonder why people feel like they don't have a self and they're lost and confused. It's like, yeah, because
And that's so true, because like if you think about it, just it's weird. Even the phenomenological experience of like the idea of wanting something or don't want
Yes.
something, and that's basically like where people stop.
yes,
And it's just like, oh my gosh, like wait, this is like you said, this is just the beginning.
Yeah,
what is it
it's-
that you want? What is it that you don't
Yeah,
want?
what
Why
is-
don't you
yes,
want it? Why
yeah,
do you
what
want it?
is the thing?
What is the
What is the
thing?
cost-benefit
What is the
analysis?
cost benefit analysis?
All
What
people talk about now
what
is
is the risk
wants.
reward? What
It's
is
like,
people
people
are there any other ones that maybe trump that want, or you know what I mean, like that would maybe be more
Yes.
that you'd maybe want to give.
trade-offs, all
Right.
these different things.
Right, exactly. Like
All people talk about is wants now, as if that,
just like with a like dislike.
yes, which is an expression of wants or diswant, dislikes or whatever. Like
wants, not wants.
Like the entire civilization, it's like making decisions and thinking on a level 1 level. Like that's it, and then we wonder why we have all the problems we have. So anyway. This has been OG Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com, Instagram, Twitter, Anchor, so on and so forth. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.